In 1787, the same summer when delegates were gathering here in Philadelphia for the first Constitutional Convention, that same summer, Catherine II, Empress of Russia, better known to us as Catherine the Great, set out on an extended tour of a large region that had been newly added to her domain. And either to impress her, or more likely to impress several foreign ambassadors who had been invited along on this tour, one of her ministers arranged for a very inventive deception. He built several villages along the banks of the river down which they were traveling in order to give the impression of a populous and thriving region. Now, they were not real villages, of course, merely facades erected alongside the river to look like villages. And as the royal barge passed by and floated on down the river, the facade would be disassembled and moved downstream, where it would become another apparently thriving village, full of people obviously delighted to be the new subjects of the famous sovereign. Now, the minister of state who arranged for this tour was a gentleman by the name of Gregory Potemkin, and his creations have gone down in history as Potemkin villages, a term that has been applied ever since to anything whose appearance is intended to deceive an observer into thinking that there is more there than is actually the case. Of course, Potemkin was far from the first person to attempt such deception. His was simply one of the more creative efforts along these lines, and no doubt has been an inspiration to those who have followed in his footsteps down to the present day. Though I think it's fair to say his modern-day successors have far surpassed him in terms of their powers of deception. Indeed, there is an entire industry devoted these days to the creation of Potemkin villages in just about every facet of life. The polishing of images which are so sophisticated that one is never entirely clear whether their efforts are aimed simply at putting the best face on what is actually there, or covering up for the fact that there is actually little or nothing behind that very attractive facade. So sophisticated, in fact, that these days we more and more often seem to prefer the image to the actual reality, even when there is a reality behind the image. Since we have gotten so good at projecting images that nowadays how something looks or how something sounds may be even more important to us than the fact of its actual existence, whether it exists or not. Because after all, it's a lot easier to produce a really attractive image of something than it is actually to bring that thing, whatever it is, into existence. Since reality can be, and often is, a rather messy affair, requiring a lot of hard work and almost always involving a number of compromises. Which is presumably why political parties these days are so much better at producing their own versions of Potemkin villages, utterly pure little ideological dream worlds, than they are at actually producing concrete results. Because actually getting something done in the real world generally requires getting your hands dirty and hammering out compromises with everyone involved, which is not nearly as attractive to donors, apparently, as coming up with those pretty little dream worlds, where everything can be exactly how we'd like it to be in our own perfect little world. And the fact that nobody actually lives like that, or that nobody even could live like that, that simple fact, that reality, tends to just get lost in the clouds. But of course, political parties have nothing on the church in this regard, since if anything, the church has done this very same thing for a whole lot longer with even less shame. In fact, religion these days, and pretty much all religions as far as I can tell, religion seems to be much more about going off and creating our own perfect little world where everything is just exactly the way we'd like it to be, than we are at actually working with other people to bring about that world, a world that may not end up perfect, but may not be exactly how we'd like it, but would certainly be a lot better than what actually exists now. Because what's merely better seems not to be good enough for us. These days, it's got to be perfect, even if that means it will never happen. Indeed, we seem to have arrived at the point where a perfect dream world is preferred by many to a merely better real world. So we religious types are all off in our own little corners, tending to our own little hothouses where we grow our own little perfect orchids of dreams, while the real world is in the process of going to hell in a handbasket. And the people who are actually out there trying to do something, actually trying to live out their religious values in the real world, often become the target of criticism because they have made compromises with reality, because they have settled for something less than a perfect world, which is not good enough for the purist. Now, I have a hunch that this or something like this is what's going on behind the Gospel of John, a gospel which seems to reflect the concerns of a very distinctive community of Christians who were out there really and truly trying to make this a better world, actually trying to live out their faith in the world. And we're taking a lot of flack for it from religious types who preferred their religion to be nice and pure, including no small number of their fellow Christians, apparently. Now, not surprisingly then, this community gathered around the so-called beloved disciple of the Gospel of John tended to view the world in very different terms than did those other religious folk, which I think is what accounts for the distinctive structure of John's Gospel, which compared to the other three Gospels, the so-called synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, reads very differently. In John, each chapter, and they tend to be much longer chapters than is the case in the other Gospels, each chapter generally consists with one thing that's happened. It's very often one of the miracles of Jesus, or as the Gospel of John prefers to call them, one of his signs. In the first few verses of most chapters, John will tell us what has happened, kind of the bare bones version of the story. And then, at much greater length, we'll go on throughout the rest of the chapter to tell us what really had happened, tearing down the facade that so often obscures the truth in so much religious talk. John intentionally tries to tell it like it really is, which is why there's a particular phrase that is used over and over again in his gospel, Jesus saying, "Very truly I tell you." And that's not just a casual expression for John. John means it quite literally. His way of saying Jesus is telling you the truth. He's telling you the real truth, unlike everyone else. For John was utterly convinced that Jesus' coming into this world had stripped away the facade and revealed the religion of his day for what it actually was, which in truth was nothing like what it claimed to be. For John, Jesus was so clearly the real deal, so genuinely the light of the world, that in his presence, all of those who opposed him were revealed for what they really were, no matter what they may have claimed to be. And almost worse than that in John's eyes were those who did recognize Jesus for what he was, who did see in Jesus the way, the truth, and the life, but who still couldn't bring themselves to let go of their places in the world in order to become his followers, to actually walk in his footsteps and be seen in his company. They just could not make that choice. And like Nicodemus, they would only come to Jesus by night, as it were, come to him under the cover of darkness when no one could see them. Eventually, as was inevitable in John's eyes, it all came to a head. And the religious authorities had to get rid of Jesus. They had to if they were to maintain any credibility and therefore any authority at all. Which is why in our gospel lesson this morning, Jesus says, "Now is the judgment of this world." Because his presence in their midst had forced their hands, had even flushed out the ruler of this world out of the shadows into the light to be revealed for who he truly is: the Prince of Darkness, the Prince of Hypocrisy, the Prince of Lies, the enemy of all that was good and true. And so it was only a matter of time. And as Jesus knew full well, and as he warned his followers, it wouldn't stop with just him. They'd also turn on his followers, at least on those who took his words seriously enough to actually try to live by them. And sure enough, they did turn on them, and they are still turning on them today. In 1845, the American poet James Russell Lowell published a poem, a quite lengthy poem actually, a very small portion of which is excerpted on the cover of your bulletin this morning. Portions of this poem that I've put on the bulletin were later adapted into a famous hymn that some of you may remember from older hymnals, the title of that hymn being "Once to Every Man and Nation." The title of the poem, however, was "The Present Crisis." Now, crisis is itself actually a Greek word. It's a word that means judgment. So that when Jesus says here in John, "Now is the judgment of this world," he's literally saying now is the crisis. The crisis. The moment to decide between truth and falsehood, the moment that forces your hand so that you have to make a decision. Lowell wrote this poem during the war with Mexico in the 1840s, a war that in his mind presented Americans with a moral crisis, with the need for a decision. No doubt Lowell was right that it was a moment to decide, but he was wrong that such a moment only comes once to each person and nation, for a far greater crisis than that came upon this nation only a few years later in the Civil War. And there have been other such moments, other such crises in the years ever since. Notably in my own life in the 1950s and 60s, when there was clearly a crisis in this country, a moment to decide. a time to decide between truth and between falsehood, especially for those who lived in parts of the country where that was really the only decision that really mattered, and where that decision, when made faithfully, often came at a very high cost. Frankly, it is one of the reasons I have never held the Reverend Billy Graham in particularly high regard, though I have no doubt but that he was a man of great moral rectitude and personal integrity and did a great deal of good. But the fact is, in the years when he was most active as a voice of the church, on the great moral question of his day, the great moral crisis then facing the nation, whether African Americans were ever going to be regarded truly as citizens of this nation, on that question, Billy Graham was silent. In the hour of judgment, his silence, along with the silence of so many other white Christians, turned the Church of Jesus Christ into just another Potemkin village. Something that looked good, but in the end could not bring itself to speak the truth. That decision does not just come once. It comes more often. And when it comes, it is for all of us a moment to decide the crisis when we will choose between truth and falsehood, when we will choose between light and darkness, when we will choose between the justice and righteousness of God and the ways of this world. Pray God that we choose faithfully.